Commander Kieran Drake had not expected his diplomatic mission to Velmara to involve this much trekking through rugged alien terrain. His black armored suit was uncomfortably warm under the light of the twin suns, and the plasma rifle strapped to his back seemed heavier with every step. Still, as Earth's newly appointed ambassador to the Velmaran people, he understood the importance of first-hand experience with their customs. The crystalline cliffs around him shimmered with an almost ethereal glow, steam rising from scattered hot springs dotting the rocky expanse. His Velmaran guide had mentioned the springs were sacred, though frustratingly they had not elaborated on why. Cultural sensitivity is paramount, Kieran muttered, recalling his extensive briefing. The Velmarans were known for their rigid traditions and strict adherence to ancient laws. One wrong move could result in disaster. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead, and checked his navigation device. The diplomatic compound should be just over the next ridge. As he rounded a bend, the quiet bubbling of water caught his ear. Steam thickened in the air, swirling around a secluded pool. Then he saw her. A woman with luminous, pale blue skin and flowing dark hair stood waist-deep in the steaming water. Her otherworldly beauty was striking, but it took Kieran a moment to process what he was witnessing, because she was completely unclothed. Their eyes met. The woman's deep violet irises widened in shock. In a single fluid motion, she seized a white cloth and wrapped it around herself, but it was too late. "You have seen me unclothed," she declared, her voice sharp with both authority and alarm. "By the laws of my people, there are only two options: marriage or death for us both." Kieran felt his stomach drop. "Wait, what?" "There are no accidents in matters of honor." Her voice was steady, but there was unmistakable urgency in her gaze. "You must choose human. Become my mate, or we will both be executed at sunset." Kieran ran a hand over his face. "That's insane." "I didn't mean to." A distant horn echoed through the cliffs, cutting him off. The woman's expression darkened. "The temple guards," she whispered. "Someone saw you enter the sacred grounds?" Heavy footsteps grew closer. Voices called out in the Velmaran tongue. "Hide," she hissed, gesturing toward a concealed cave behind the spring. "Quickly. I will try to misdirect them, but know this, Kieran Drake. There is no undoing what has happened here. Think carefully before you make your choice." Heart pounding, Kieran crouched in the shadows of the cave. Through the mist, he saw armored figures approach the woman, their imposing forms partially obscured by steam. "Lady Seris," one of the guards called out, his tone both respectful and suspicious. "Your presence here is unexpected. The sacred springs are reserved for purification rituals at this hour." "Seris. So that was her name." Seris lifted her chin, her voice steady. "Captain Vale, I was unaware of any scheduled ceremonies. I came here for private meditation." "There are reports of an intruder," another guard said. "A human male was seen entering this sector. Have you encountered any outsiders?" Seris scoffed, her voice carrying just the right note of indignation. "How could I? I have been performing my ablutions. Would a human dare intrude upon such a sacred moment?" From his hiding place, Kieran found himself admiring her quick thinking, even as guilt gnawed at him for being exactly that intruding human. Captain Vale hesitated before his tone softened. "My lady, as the daughter of High Chancellor Saurian, you should not be wandering alone. These are dangerous times with so many off-worlders on Velmara." Kieran stiffened. High Chancellor's daughter? Fantastic. This situation had just gone from bad to worse. Seris inclined her head. "I appreciate your concern, Captain, but I assure you I am more than capable of protecting myself. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must dress and return to the palace." The guards murmured their acknowledgments and withdrew. Kieran waited several tense moments before Seris reappeared at the cave entrance, now clad in an iridescent robe that seemed to shimmer like liquid crystal. "We don't have much time," she murmured, offering her hand. "The guards will realize soon that no intruder was found. We must reach the palace before they complete their patrol." Kieran hesitated only briefly before taking her hand. Her fingers were cool but strong, fitting perfectly within his. "You're the High Chancellor's daughter. Why didn't you mention that earlier?" Seris gave him a wry smile. "Would it have changed your reaction to our predicament?" He exhaled sharply. "Probably not. Besides," she added, leading him along a narrow path, "titles mean little in the face of sacred law. Even my father cannot override traditions that predate our space age." They climbed in silence for a moment before Kieran finally asked, "These laws, are they really that absolute? No exceptions for misunderstandings or diplomatic immunity?" Seris laughed softly, the sound unexpectedly musical. Our people achieved interstellar travel 3 centuries ago, yet we still arrange marriages based on who sees whom bathing. What does that tell you about how seriously we take tradition? It tells me your people are full of contradictions, Kieran muttered. But you still haven't explained why marriage is the only alternative to execution. She paused on the path and turned to face him. The twin suns bathed her in golden light, making her seem almost ethereal. The springs are sacred because they reveal truth, she explained. When you saw me there, you saw my true self. No masks, no pretense, only essence. In our culture, that creates an unbreakable bond. To reject such a bond is to reject truth itself. And to reject truth, she hesitated, is punishable by death. Kieran swallowed. And if I accept? Seris stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Then you accept me as I am, and I accept you as you are. We become bound, not just by law but by choice and truth. The intensity in her gaze sent a shiver through him. This was madness. He was a diplomat, trained to navigate complex political negotiations, not to marry alien royalty because of some archaic custom. And yet, something about her made him question everything he thought he knew. We should keep moving, Seris said softly, breaking the moment. The palace has secret passages we can use. Once inside, we can discuss our options. As they climbed higher, Kieran caught her stealing glances at him, assessing, considering. He found himself doing the same. The palace soon loomed ahead, its crystalline spires reaching toward the heavens like frozen flames. He should have been planning his escape or at the very least figuring out how to contact the Earth Embassy. Instead, he found himself wondering what it would mean to accept Seris's words. To accept her. And for the first time since stepping onto Velmara, Kieran wasn't sure if he wanted to run from this strange new world, or stay and see where this path would lead. Chapter 2, The Choice of the Veil. Kieran's boots crunched softly against the ancient stones as he and Seris approached the entrance to the palace. The narrow, winding path they had followed seemed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding cliffs, the mist rising in ghostly tendrils around them. The palace stood like a monolith ahead, its shimmering towers reflecting the twin suns' dying light as though they were made of pure liquid crystal. They reached a hidden alcove near the palace walls, where Seris pressed a small, concealed panel, activating a series of shifting stones. The entrance revealed itself with a soft, grinding hum, and they slipped into the cool, shadowed corridor. Kieran glanced over at Seris as she led him down the hidden passage, her robe trailing behind her like a faint mist. The sight of her seemed at odds with the urgency of their situation, elegant, composed, yet with a deep current of tension beneath her calm exterior. How many others know of this passage? Kieran asked, keeping his voice low. Seris glanced back, her violet eyes unreadable. Very few. Only trusted members of the council. She paused, then added with a wry smile, and the occasional daughter of a high-ranking official who has a penchant for solitude. Kieran couldn't help but let out a small chuckle. You really are full of surprises, Seris? Her lips quirked. I prefer to be underestimated. They moved deeper into the palace, passing through a series of narrow, winding corridors that opened into vast chambers filled with strange, glowing artifacts and tapestries depicting Velmaran history. Each room seemed to pulse with energy, an otherworldly combination of the ancient and the futuristic. As they approached what Kieran assumed was Seris's private quarters, she finally slowed, glancing at him with a level of intensity that took him by surprise. You haven't asked yet, she said softly, her voice low but steady. Why I didn't tell you about my status earlier? Kieran, taken aback, tried to focus on her words. I assumed it was because you didn't want to complicate things. But, he paused, unsure of how to phrase it. But now I'm wondering why you chose to tell me at all. You know the consequences. Why involve me further? Seris's gaze softened for a moment, and she exhaled slowly as if weighing her words. It's simple, really. I didn't expect you to act on impulse. I didn't expect you to care. She turned, pushing open the door to her chambers. But now I find myself questioning everything, including why I didn't expect that from you. Kieran stepped into the room after her, feeling the weight of her words. The space was unlike anything he had seen before, soft, shimmering walls of crystal, bathed in the light of the two suns. The warmth of the air felt familiar, as though he had been enveloped in the very essence of the sacred springs where their paths had first crossed. Seris moved to a small table and poured a shimmering liquid into 2 delicate glass goblets. This is the last chance to change your mind, she said quietly, holding one of the goblets out to him. Once the marriage bond is sealed, there is no turning back. You will be bound to Velmara, to me, for the rest of your life. Kieran hesitated, his fingers brushing the cool glass of the goblet. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this, Seris. I came here as a diplomat, a representative of Earth. I didn't expect any of this." He glanced down at the drink, the light of the room reflecting off the surface, distorting the liquid within. "But you're right. The truth is, I can't stop thinking about what you said earlier." Seris raised an eyebrow, her dark eyes focused on him. "About what?" "The bond," he said, lowering his voice. "The idea of accepting who we are as we are." He trailed off, searching for the right words. "It's complicated, but somehow it feels right." Seris didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her movements fluid and deliberate. Her gaze was piercing, studying him as if trying to read every thought that crossed his mind. "The bond is not just ceremonial, Kieran. It is the foundation of our world, our way of life. A Velmaran who rejects it is seen as a threat to everything we hold sacred." She paused, lifting her chin slightly. "If you choose this, you will become part of something much larger than yourself. Not just a political ally, a true partner, a true mate. It will be more than just the law that binds us. It will be the truth we share." Kieran swallowed, the weight of her words sinking into his chest like an anchor. He had always prided himself on being level-headed, on understanding diplomacy and politics. But now, the complexity of their situation felt like a swirling storm inside him, impossible to contain. He took the goblet from her, his hand shaking slightly as he met her gaze. "I'm not sure I can give you all the answers you're looking for, Seris, but I do know one thing. I don't want to face this alone." Seris's expression softened, the hardness in her eyes fading into something more vulnerable, more human. She took a step closer, her breath barely audible. "Then you'll face it with me." The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to touch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside seemed to fade away as the crystal walls pulsed with an otherworldly glow, the anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Kieran took a deep breath and nodded. "All right. We'll do it. We'll face whatever comes next together." Seris's lips curved into a slight, knowing smile. "Then the bond is formed. The choice is made." As they stood in the soft light of her chambers, Kieran couldn't help but feel that, for better or worse, his life had just taken a turn he could never have anticipated. Chapter 3, Bound by the Veil. The air was thick with the hum of distant energy, a constant presence within the walls of Velmara's palace. Kieran couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had known, everything he had ever trained for as a diplomat, had been turned upside down. Here, in the heart of Seris's world, rules that govern life and death were as binding as gravity. He had just agreed to become part of it, a decision that felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. Seris led him deeper into the palace after sealing their agreement. The corridors grew more intricate as they moved, the walls shifting color with the light of the twin suns outside. A constant undercurrent of magic seemed to ripple through the stone, and every step he took felt as if the very ground beneath him was watching, waiting. Finally, they reached a large chamber at the heart of the palace, its entrance guarded by a set of enormous double doors, carved with intricate patterns depicting the history of Velmara. Seris gestured for Kieran to enter first, and he did, stepping into a space that seemed to defy the natural world. The room was circular, its walls made entirely of shifting crystal, pulsating with an ethereal glow. The floor beneath their feet was made of a smooth, reflective stone, and in the center stood an altar, a raised platform surrounded by arcane symbols that seemed to swirl with a light of their own. Atop the altar, a single object rested, a silver veil, delicate and shimmering, almost as though it were made of moonlight itself. "This," Seris said, her voice soft and reverent, "is the veil of truth. It binds our fates together when the bond is formed. If you choose to wear it, there is no turning back." Kieran's heart beat faster as he gazed at the veil. It was beautiful, but there was an intensity to it that unnerved him. He had never imagined his diplomatic mission could lead him to this moment, to a sacred ritual that demanded so much. He had been taught to respect the customs of other cultures, but this was something entirely different. This was not a simple exchange of knowledge or trade. This was a covenant between lives. Seris stepped forward, her hand hovering over the veil. "The ceremony will mark our union, but it is more than that. It is a reflection of the bond we share, of the truth we have accepted. The moment it touches your skin, we will be irrevocably bound to each other, both in law and in heart." Kieran swallowed hard. He had not fully understood the weight of the commitment until now. This was no mere formality, it was a declaration. And the consequences of rejection, as Seris had explained, were death. "I've already made my decision," Kieran said, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. But how do I know I'm doing the right thing? Seris turned to him, her violet eyes locked onto his. There was a softness there now, an openness he hadn't seen before. It's not about being right or wrong, she said quietly. It's about truth. You saw me. You saw who I am without pretense. And I saw you, Kieran. Not as a diplomat, not as an outsider, but as a person who is willing to face something greater than themselves. Kieran felt a weight in his chest. Her words stirred something deep inside him, something he had buried under layers of duty and responsibility. He had always seen himself as someone who controlled his fate, someone who made calculated decisions. But Seris had shown him something else, something that demanded a choice from his very soul. Then let's do it, he said finally, his voice thick with resolve. Let's face whatever comes next together. Seris smiled, a rare and genuine expression that made Kieran's heart skip a beat. She walked to the altar, lifting the veil carefully with both hands. As she approached him, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. When you wear the veil, you accept not only me but our people, our traditions and everything that comes with it. It is not just a ceremony, it is a lifetime. Kieran nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to take the veil from her. It felt impossibly light in his hands, and yet he could feel the weight of it, the weight of all that was to come. With a deep breath, he draped the veil over his head. The moment it touched his skin, a surge of energy rippled through him, as though the very air around them had shifted. He felt a profound connection to Seris, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The room seemed to pulse with the energy of their union, and Kieran felt his heartbeat align with hers in a way that was both overwhelming and comforting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the palace, and the beating of their shared heart. Finally, Seris's voice broke the silence. You've made your choice, Kieran. And now we walk this path together. Kieran looked at her, his breath catching in his throat as he saw her not just as the daughter of a high counselor, but as someone who had become a part of him. This bond, this union, it was more than he had ever expected from this mission, more than he had ever dreamed of. I don't know what the future holds, Kieran said softly, his hand brushing hers. But I know I'm not walking it alone. Seris's smile deepened, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something more than duty in her eyes. Neither of us are, Kieran. Neither of us. Chapter 4, The Unseen Forces. Kieran and Seris stood side by side, their hands lightly touching as the veil settled around them. The bond was formed, irrevocable, undeniable. But the tension that had hung in the air since their agreement was far from gone. If anything, it had only grown heavier, more palpable, as if the very walls of the palace were holding their breath. The veil of truth shimmered faintly with the energy of their union, a symbol of the bond that had been forged. Kieran had felt the moment it touched his skin, a sharp surge of warmth and light that had radiated outward from his chest. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but there was no denying it now. The connection between them wasn't just a legal formality, it was something deeper, something ancient. Seris, ever composed, stood still for a moment, her dark eyes focused on some far-off point. Then, with a single, deliberate motion, she lifted the veil from Kieran's face, revealing his features once again. We are now bound, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of something both beautiful and terrifying. Not just by law but by truth. Kieran nodded, feeling the gravity of her words settle in. And now what? She turned toward him, her gaze steady and filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Now we must face the consequences of our choice. Before Kieran could respond, a sudden commotion outside the chamber caught their attention. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor, followed by the unmistakable clatter of armored boots. Kieran's pulse quickened. They're coming, Seris muttered under her breath, her tone darkening. We don't have much time. Without another word, she moved swiftly toward the far side of the chamber, her robes trailing behind her. Kieran followed, instinctively reaching for the hilt of the plasma blade strapped to his side. His diplomatic training had taught him to avoid violence at all costs, but now the stakes had shifted. His life, and Seris's, were on the line. Seris pressed her palm to another hidden panel on the wall, and the stone before them parted to reveal a narrow passageway leading deeper into the heart of the palace. This way, she urged, stepping inside. Kieran followed closely behind, the weight of the situation settling more heavily with each step. What had he walked into? He had come to Celestia Prime as an ambassador for Earth, not a participant in an ancient ritual of life and death. And yet, here he was, bound to an alien princess by a law that could not be defied. Who's coming? Kieran asked as they moved swiftly through the winding corridors, their footsteps barely making a sound. "The Temple Guard," Seris replied, her voice laced with tension. "They are loyal to the ancient laws. They will not care about our bond. If they discover what we've done, they will execute us both." Kieran's mind raced. It was hard to believe how quickly things had escalated. He had thought that by agreeing to the bond, they would have somehow avoided the dire consequences. But the laws of Velmara were not so easily circumvented. They emerged from the passage into a large chamber, its walls lined with statues of ancient Velmaran rulers. The air here was thick with the scent of incense, and soft, shimmering light from the ceiling illuminated the room in a dreamlike glow. At the far end of the chamber stood a large door, the design intricately carved with symbols Kieran didn't fully understand. Seris approached the door, her fingers tracing the ancient markings. "This is the Chamber of the Ancients," she explained softly. "It is where all matters of great consequence are decided." She turned to Kieran, her face serious. "We must go inside. There we can hide until the Temple Guard has passed. Then we will decide what to do next." Kieran nodded, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. They had just pledged their lives to each other, but what did that really mean in a world where law and tradition held so much weight? What was to stop them from being torn apart by forces beyond their control? As Seris pushed the door open, the room beyond was shrouded in shadow. The air was cooler here, and the walls seemed to absorb the light, creating an almost oppressive atmosphere. Kieran stepped inside, his senses heightened. The room was empty save for an altar at the center, and the faint, distant sound of voices echoed from beyond the stone walls. "Why here?" Kieran asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Seris stepped closer, her gaze intense. "This is a sacred space. The ancients watch over us here. If we are to survive, we must first understand what they expect from us." Before Kieran could ask more, the faint hum of energy in the air grew louder, and Seris's expression hardened. "They're here." Kieran's hand instinctively went to his weapon. He had no experience with the Temple Guard, but he knew they were formidable. His mind raced, trying to devise a plan, but Seris was already moving, her movements smooth and practiced as she reached for a small crystal embedded in the altar. She pressed it, and the walls around them began to shift, revealing a hidden doorway. "We're running out of time," Seris said, urgency now filling her voice. Without hesitation, they darted through the newly revealed passageway, the sound of the guards' approaching footsteps echoing louder in the silence. The tunnel they entered was narrow and winding, and Kieran could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Every step seemed to echo off the walls, a reminder of the danger they were in. "Where are we going?" Kieran asked, his voice strained. "To the sanctum," Seris replied. "It's the only place we can be safe for now." The passageway seemed to stretch on forever, but Seris moved with a sense of purpose, her focus unwavering. Kieran tried to keep up, his mind still racing with the implications of what had just happened. He had been thrust into a life-or-death game of tradition and law, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. Finally, they reached the end of the tunnel, and Seris pushed open a heavy door, leading them into a small, dimly lit chamber. The air here was cool, and the walls were covered in ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with faint, otherworldly energy. Kieran looked around, trying to catch his breath. "What now?" Seris turned to face him, her face etched with determination. "Now we wait. The Temple Guard will search the palace, but they will not find us here. And when they are gone, we will decide our next move." Kieran nodded, his mind still reeling from the whirlwind of events. He had come to Celestia Prime as a diplomat, but now he wasn't sure what he was anymore. A man caught between worlds? A pawn in an ancient game? But in that moment, standing beside Seris, he felt the weight of their bond more than ever. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Chapter 5. The Choice of Truth. The silence in the sanctum was almost deafening. The only sound was the soft rustle of Seris's robes as she moved to stand near the far wall, her dark eyes fixed on something only she could see. Kieran stood at the center of the room, his mind swirling with questions. The weight of their bond hung heavily between them, like an invisible chain that both connected and bound them. The passage they had entered led to a secluded chamber deep within the palace. Despite the tension of their situation, the place had a strange serenity to it. The walls were adorned with carvings of the ancients, their faces calm and expressionless, eyes seeming to watch them from every angle. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the soft, flickering light from the wall sconces cast long shadows across the stone floor. Seris was quiet, almost distant, but Kieran knew better than to assume she was unbothered. This had to be as much of a shock to her as it was to him. They were both prisoners of tradition now, bound by an ancient law that had left them with few options. The room was cold, Yet Kieran could feel the heat of uncertainty building inside him, a slow burn that threatened to consume him whole. Seris finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "We must understand what comes next." Kieran's brow furrowed as he turned to face her. "What do you mean? I thought this bond was irreversible. Doesn't that mean we're stuck with it? We just wait for the guards to leave and then, what? Go our separate ways?" She shook her head, her expression unreadable. "It is not that simple, Kieran. Our bond is sacred, but it is not a solution to everything. It is a beginning, not an end." Kieran stepped closer to her, trying to make sense of her words. "A beginning to what? To a life together? I don't even know what that means. What's expected of me?" Seris's eyes softened slightly, her gaze meeting his. There was something in her expression, something that made Kieran's pulse race despite himself. "It means we will face a choice, Kieran. Not just for ourselves but for our people." "Choice? What choice?" He couldn't keep the frustration from his voice. "I didn't come here to play some part in a ritual. I came as a diplomat. I came to negotiate, not to be thrust into a marriage." She took a deep breath, her lips pressing together as if trying to find the right words. "The choice we face is whether to honor the truth that the bond reveals, or reject it." Kieran's head spun as he tried to grasp the meaning of her words. "Reject it? What would that mean?" "The truth is a powerful thing," Seris explained, her tone soft but firm. "When two souls are bound in the way that we are, there is no going back. The ancients designed this law to ensure that when truth is revealed, it is accepted. To reject the truth is to dishonor the very essence of who we are. So if I don't accept the bond, if I don't marry you," Kieran's voice faltered for a moment as the weight of it all hit him. "You will die," she finished for him, her voice tinged with an edge of sorrow. "And so will I." Kieran stared at her, the words sinking in like a heavy stone dropped into the center of his chest. The truth of their situation was clear now. There was no escape. The law was unforgiving and their choices were limited. "But what if I don't want this?" he asked quietly, the words feeling strange on his tongue. Seris met his gaze, her dark eyes unwavering. "It is not about what we want, Kieran. It is about what is. The truth that binds us has existed for centuries, long before either of us were born. You saw me as I truly am, without the guise of politics or pretense. There is no undoing that." Kieran's mind raced. He had never been one to follow tradition blindly, especially not when it came to something as personal as marriage. But this wasn't just any tradition, it was the law of the ancients. And it had consequences that neither he nor Seris could avoid. "So, if we accept, we're bound together?" Kieran asked, the finality of his words hanging in the air. "Yes," Seris said, her voice steady. "In every way." The air between them grew thick with tension, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the decision pressed down on Kieran's chest like a heavy cloak, suffocating him. He had never imagined his diplomatic mission would end like this, tangled in the web of an alien culture's ancient rituals, forced into a marriage with a woman he barely knew. And yet, standing there in the quiet sanctum with Seris, something inside him shifted. There was an undeniable pull toward her, an undeniable truth that had been revealed when their eyes first met in the misty springs. He didn't understand it, but he couldn't deny it. "Is this what you want?" Kieran asked softly, his voice raw. "To be bound like this?" Seris didn't immediately answer. She turned away, walking toward the far wall and placing her hand against the cool stone. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke again. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "None of us do. But this bond, it's not just a law. It's an opportunity to build something new. Together." Kieran felt his heart tighten at her words. He had expected defiance, perhaps anger, but not this quiet acceptance. Seris wasn't just following the law, she was living it, embracing it with a calm resolve that Kieran found both comforting and disconcerting. The sounds of the temple guards grew louder outside the chamber, their steps echoing down the hallway. Kieran's thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear, there was no turning back now. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Kieran admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. Seris turned back to face him, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "No one is ever truly ready for what truth demands. But we must choose, Kieran. The only question that remains is, will you choose to stand by me?" Kieran took a deep breath, the weight of his decision hanging in the air. His life, his future, was now tied to Seris, and there was no turning back from the path they had started down. Whether he wanted to or not, whether he was ready or not, he knew what he had to do. "I choose you," Kieran said, his voice steady though his heart raced. "I choose this bond. I choose us." Seris's eyes softened, and for the first time since their bond was formed, a genuine warmth flickered behind her gaze. "Then we are truly bound, Kieran Blackwood," she whispered. "And together we will face whatever comes next." Chapter 6, The Final Choice. The corridors of the palace were eerily quiet as Kieran and Seris moved swiftly through them, their footsteps echoing against the cold, polished stone. Every turn they took seemed to lead them deeper into the heart of the ancient structure, where the weight of centuries-old customs and laws pressed in from every direction. The tension that had lingered between them since their bond was sealed now crackled in the air, a constant reminder of the choice they had made, whether they wanted to face it or not. Kieran kept his gaze ahead, his mind still racing with the implications of their decision. His diplomatic training, once so vital, seemed so distant now. He'd trained to negotiate, to handle complex situations, to be in control. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. Marriage to an alien princess, bound by an ancient law, with a death sentence hanging over their heads if they failed to comply. Seris was quiet beside him, her face set in a determined expression, though Kieran could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She too was struggling with what had just occurred, but unlike him, she seemed resolute. She'd known from the start that this was her fate. He hadn't, but he'd accepted it. There was no other choice. They reached a large, intricately carved door, and Seris paused before pushing it open. Inside, the room was vast and filled with light from large windows that framed the setting twin suns. It was the heart of the palace, the council chamber where the fate of Celestia Prime had been decided for generations. But now it was where their fates would be sealed. Seris stepped into the room first, her hand brushing over the smooth surface of the doorframe as if drawing strength from it. Kieran followed, his mind still a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "We must go to the council," Seris said, her voice quiet but firm. "My father and the others will want to know our decision. They'll want to see if we're truly committed to what we've agreed to." Kieran nodded but remained silent, his gaze fixed on the stone floor. He knew what was expected of him. But was he ready to accept his new life? Could he truly become part of this world? Become her partner in every sense of the word? The chamber was a grand hall, filled with high-backed chairs and a large circular table at its center. Around the table sat various members of Celestia Prime's ruling council, all of them older than Seris, their faces stern, as though they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. They all rose as Seris entered, their gazes turning toward her. The High Counselor, Seris's father, was seated at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. His piercing eyes locked with Kieran's as Seris took her place beside him. "My daughter, Seris, and Ambassador Kieran Blackwood," the High Counselor said, his voice booming through the chamber. "The time has come. You have both made your choice. Now it is up to us to decide the future of our people." Kieran stood tall, trying to meet the council's gaze with as much composure as he could muster. His life had changed in ways he could never have anticipated. He was no longer just an ambassador. He was now a part of something much greater, something that transcended borders, races, and planets. The council's decision would decide whether he truly belonged here, whether he would live or whether he would die. A woman seated at the opposite end of the table, with silver hair and a sharp gaze, spoke first. "The bond has been formed. We know this, but the question remains, will it hold? Will this marriage, this bond, strengthen our people and our alliances with Earth? Or will it tear us apart?" Kieran felt Seris's hand brush his lightly, a small but significant gesture. He looked at her, and for the first time since their encounter in the sacred spring, he saw a hint of vulnerability in her expression. She didn't look like the confident, determined woman who had guided him through the strange rituals of their culture. In that moment she seemed as uncertain as he was. "I understand your concerns," Kieran said, his voice strong despite the doubt that clawed at him. "But I came here with the intention of fostering peace, of building something meaningful between our worlds. This bond, while unexpected, will not change that. I will do everything in my power to honor it." The council murmured among themselves, but the High Counselor raised his hand, silencing them. "I know you, Kieran Blackwood," he said, his voice cold. "I know your Earth customs. But here you must understand that we are not bound by the same laws. If you are to marry my daughter, it is not just a political alliance. It is a sacred bond. One that demands your loyalty and your truth." Kieran looked at Seris, who met his gaze with unwavering steadiness. He could see the weight of the law, the truth, in her eyes. The same truth that had bound them together in the first place. "I understand," Kieran said, nodding slowly. "I will stand by Seris. I will stand by this bond. But I need to know, are you prepared for the consequences of this? For what comes after?" The High Counselor's gaze softened just for a moment before it hardened again. You have chosen to honor the law of the ancients, Kieran Blackwood. You have chosen to stand with Seris. And in doing so, you have chosen a life beyond the stars. There is no going back now. The room fell silent, and Kieran felt the weight of those words settle on him like a stone. Seris stood from her seat, moving toward the center of the room. We have made our choice, Father. I accept the responsibility. Kieran accepts the responsibility. Together we will face what comes next. The High Counselor nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. Very well. You are bound by law. And by truth. With that, the council rose from their seats, one by one, their faces solemn. But there was something in the air, something that felt like a new beginning. Kieran turned to Seris, feeling the finality of their decision settle over him. He could feel the bond between them now, undeniable and unbreakable. There was no turning back. The weight of it all was immense, but there was a flicker of something else too. Something that made him believe, despite everything, that perhaps this was where he was meant to be. I didn't think I'd end up here, Kieran said, his voice softer now. Seris smiled, a faint, knowing smile. None of us ever truly know where life will lead us, Kieran. But sometimes, it's the unexpected paths that teach us the most. Kieran nodded, his heart steady now. He didn't know what the future would bring. But one thing was clear, he had made his choice. And in doing so, he had found something that transcended even the laws of Celestia Prime. Together they would face whatever came next.